A Saturday evening, George and Maria walked down the pest side of the Danube. Searchlights sweep the sky as if in celebration of their boy's birthday. Their foreboding is matched now only by his glee. In the same way he had every reason to be happy, George and Maria had every reason to be afraid. Poland, after the arrival of German saboteurs on Friday night, just after midnight, with its full army arriving throughout the following day, on Saturday, had upgraded their state of emergency to a state of war. A madman had unsheathed his sword. Poland was his first victim. But András did not care. He was 3. For a moment in the 19th century, America's Jews looked like they had found their new home, their new Jerusalem. But companies like Western Union and the Bell Telephone Company, using general purpose and patented technologies which allowed them to become monopolies, hoovered up and then hoarded all of their winnings. The private gains of those companies came at the public's expense. Deteriorating economic conditions then led to rises in anti-Semitism at the moment when Charles Darwin handed white supremacists a God Almighty weapon. Armed with Darwin's theory, his half-cousin Francis Galton took his pre-existing beliefs in his own superiority, the inferiority of other races, that European scientists always seemed to place below white Europeans in their taxonomies. And Galton then concocted not just a scientific explanation for why things were as they were, but taking his thinking one step further, came up with a scientific sounding solution for what should be done about it. From the Greek for well-born, Galton called his idea for human perfectibility eugenics. Galton desperately wanted to be like his grandfathers Erasmus Darwin and Josiah Wedgwood, and a little bit like his half-cousin. He was, unfortunately, an egocentric snob, a spiritual fascist, and a mediocre intellect. Ooh, ouch. This goes some way to explaining his study into notable men. He wanted to prove that he was one. All he did was prove the opposite. For his famous study, now infamous study, Galton created a mathematical model with weights that predicted the inheritability of traits, mental and moral, from parents to their children and then further to their grandchildren. Armed with these models, Galton thought the principles of animal breeding could be applied to humans by encouraging the superior, as per his mathematical model, to intermarry, a little bit like Charles had intermarried with their other cousin, Emma Wedgwood. At the time, Charles, seemingly smarter and more humane than Francis, noted in his book, The Descent of Man, that education could be more important than inheritance. Thus, the nature versus nurture debate existed between half-cousins in the exact same way that it existed right across different members of society. In this debate, though, you do see something else. Charles takes the role of scientist, opposing the antagonist in this tragedy, Francis, the pseudoscientist. Charles, ever the skeptic, thought the mechanism of inheritance was not properly understood. He thought the effect of the environment was also not properly understood either, and if utopia was ever to be reached, it would be a long process. He also shared the observation that such a project would in any case risk the noblest part of our nature, namely the part of our nature that helps those in need. Francis, convinced of his ideas, pseudoscientific to their core, concluded the opposite and thus ploughed forward with eugenics, and by doing so he toppled a domino that led to the Third Reich and the Holocaust, the invasion of Poland and those searchlights on the Danube, but only after eugenics seduced and infected the most egalitarian place on earth, the United States of America. Welcome to this episode of Visionaries, Rebels and Machines. My name is Jamie Dobson, and today we will be talking about that little boy, András Gróf, and his mother, Maria. Before we go back to Hungary, though, we need to find out what happened after the idea of eugenics arrived in the United States. Well, In New York, the eugenics movement took a decisive and dark step around about 1916. That was the same year the United States Bureau of Census turned down Alexander Graham Bell's request to provide data for family lineages. Alexander Graham Bell was a eugenicist too. In 1916, a wealthy lawyer and fellow eugenicist who helped set up the Eugenics Record Office, Madison Grant, published The Passing of the Great Race. Grant, like Galton before him, couched race in scientific language. This speaks directly to the biases we all have for scientific-sounding arguments. That's the same bias, by the way, that explains why most of us are complete suckers for products with stickers on their boxes expounding the scientific benefits of whatever lays within. Madison Grant played a despicable trick when he did this because he further legitimized the eugenics movement. His use of rational and cool language, none of it scientific, explains why, according to Angela Saini in her fantastic book, Superior, Grant managed to write, without any sense of shame, whether we like to admit it or not, the result of the mixture of two races in the long run gives us a race reverting to the more ancient, generalized and lower type. Well, who said what was a lower type? White European scientists, usually. Grant continues, the cross between a white man and an Indian is an Indian. The cross between a white man and a Negro is a Negro. Well, I think we've heard just about enough from Madison Grant. He goes on and on and on. Now, in that same book, Grant says, because of how humans are usually studied, the influence of the environment is often overestimated and overstated at the expense of heredity. This is in many ways the eugenicists' creed. Traits are within humans and nothing can be done about it since the hand we must play is dealt at conception with a deck, aided by the process of natural selection, stacked in favour of so-called superior white Europeans. Now, speaking of white Europeans, a few years after the publication of The Passing of the Great Race, Madison Grant's biggest fan in Europe sent him a phone-in letter saying, "Your book is my Bible." When that happened, mainland Europe began reaping the next generation of ideas originally sown in the United Kingdom but mutated in the United States by think tanks, government departments and even government policies. According to Sussman, Madison Grant, unwittingly aided by men like Alexander Graham Bell, gift-wrapped and gave biological determinism, racial prejudice and the active agenda of eugenics right up to the Nazi regime of that phoning fan, Adolf Hitler. Armed with Grant's book and the newly invented vacuum tube, that was the thing that made radios work, Hitler rose to power. So that evening, when Maria and George walked along the Danube, German forces invaded Poland and, according to the New York Times, a madman had unsheathed his sword. Now, what was going on before that in Hungary? What was the build-up to this moment? Well, actually, Gyula Gombos had entered into a pact with Germany, the so-called Axis Arrangement, that's a term he coined, and ruled under the regency of Admiral Horthy. Horthy was an admiral who, since the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, had no navy, and even if he had one, he had no sea to sail it in. That's a pretty strange situation for an admiral. Now, Horthy, although an anti-Semite, had little enthusiasm for taking the eugenics project to its conclusion by murdering hundreds of thousands of his own citizens. This meant Hungary's Jews, in the early years of the war at least, avoided the fate of Polish and Czechoslovakian Jews. That changed in 1944. Horthy, he knew the Axis powers could now not win, and so he began to sue for peace. Hitler immediately installed a puppet government. András, now aged 8, watched neat, tidy, confident German soldiers march straight into Budapest. Eichmann had arrived and, as per the eugenics project, he came to take care of the Jewish problem himself. Mother and son escaped to the countryside. András' dad, George, had long been drafted and thought dead. Maria then received a tip-off and escaped back to Budapest, and then in a remarkable game of cat and mouse managed to avoid the SS patrols sweeping the countryside, who between May and July 1944 gathered up and sent 430,000 Jews to their deaths. Back in Budapest, Horthy announced an armistice. The Germans captured him, replaced his government with the rabidly anti-Semitic Arrow Cross, which, in response, Swedish, Swiss, Portuguese, El Salvadorian and Nicaraguan diplomats issued thousands of protective documents. The Spanish embassy went one step further and arranged 5,000 safe houses as men like Father András Kun executed Jews, shrieking as his final order, "In the name of Christ, fire!" Later that year, Budapest descended further into hell when the Soviets surrounded the city on the 29th of December. The Battle of Budapest, considered by many to be the worst of the war, ended on the 13th of February 1945. 300,000 Soviets, 65,000 Hungarian citizens and 15,000 Jews murdered by the Arrow Cross in their final reign of terror were now dead. By a miracle, András and Maria survived, only to then become witnesses, and in Maria's case a victim, of what historians called the largest mass rape in history. To call what happened in Budapest grim is to downplay what was a never-ending, seemingly to me, descent into hell. You would like to think after the war that descent started to come to an end, but it did not. After the war, Hungary joined the communist bloc. The Soviets rebuilt bridges, built universities and schools, and therefore, for a short time, the Soviets did what they claimed communism would do. They provided houses and schools, and they threw open the theatre doors to the children of peasants. A super-sized statue of Stalin went up, but far out of sight, the fascist bullies of the Arrow Cross found a new home and job as Soviet boot boys in their secret police, the soon-to-be-dreaded ARVO. The Soviets thus arrived as liberators and brothers who promised to feed Hungary, yet in a few years, despite the propaganda saying otherwise, Hungary starved. A full 10 years after the Battle of Budapest, András made it to university. Like so many living under the boot heel of an oppressive regime, he got on with his life. But as 54 gave way to 55, the Eastern Bloc's bubbling resentment at the slow, silent and not exactly invisible terror of the secret police mirrored his own. The death of Bolesław Bierut in Poland in 56 lit the fuse that blew up a powder keg of protests right across the communist bloc. In Hungary, it exploded right inside András's university. The students there wanted better economic conditions, the cessation of forced Russian in schools, and they wanted Hungarian uranium to stay within Hungary. And of course, they wanted the hammer and sickle removing from their flag. On October the 23rd, like a river fed by tributaries, crowds in the centre swelled. Streets emptied, trams stopped. The crowd garroted that statue of Stalin. Old women wanting to spit on his face fought with an engineer who wanted to hammer the head off to make bullets with. András and the demonstrators then marched to Radio Budapest. A delegation entered to negotiate. Before he got there, though, a member of the secret police opened fire. Just like that, the Hungarian Revolution had begun, and András was right in the middle of it. Scared, he headed home. Hungary then enjoyed 5 days of freedom before the Soviets returned. When they did not come back with Russian soldiers, but Central Asian satellite troops who had no relationship or fondness for the Hungarians. These troops were met by children. One 12-year-old boy, grenades lashed to his chest, took out the lead tank of a convoy. The children came with brooms, bottles, petrol, bits of pipe. They, by a miracle of tenacity, held Castle Hill for 3 days against Soviet military technology. When they finally marched out with their white flag, a Russian commander ordered their mowing down. Their bodies and blood splashed across the cobblestones like brushstrokes. In their final moments of life, the children held hands and reached out to touch each other's fingers. George Orwell clocked that you cannot run a totalitarian regime without a secret police force and the accompanying terror it brings with it. Nobody ever really believed Orwell. Did the Soviets really do all of that to maintain control? After the Hungarian Revolution, for the very first time, the world saw the truth. Budapest's children paid the price for that truth with their lives on Castle Hill. The Americans and British, after encouraging the Hungarians to rise up against the communists, left Hungary to their fate. After the Soviets retook Budapest, those who took part in the demonstrations began to disappear. A photograph of anyone at a protest was a death sentence, but so too was a spiteful word from a neighbour. This situation called Maria and her sister, Nancy, an Auschwitz survivor, to action. Their instincts spoke, and they spoke loudly. András was getting the hell out of Hungary. Within hours, he was on a train to the Austrian border where he was ripped off by a guard who had promised to help. Hours of traipsing through the dark, covered in mud, he came across a hunchback? The last farmer on the last farm in Hungary? This fairy tale of ogres, invaders, secret messengers, generous strangers continued when the farmhouse door opened. There stood a stunningly beautiful and colourful woman, the hunchback's wife. My goodness, someone somewhere had sowed the wind, and András now wept a peculiar whirlwind. This whirlwind brought András to that point where he carried out his final act in Hungary. Perched on the trunk of a tree, one hand stabilising on the knot of the tree opposite, his filthy, mud-caked trousers, the only ones he owned, around his ankles, he must have wondered, will this be my last memory of Hungary before I cross the border to Austria? If the crossing did not happen, the best he could hope for, if discovered, was a quick death. A hail of bullets or a landmine would do it. The alternative in the hands of the Arvo was far worse. He'd have been forgiven, balanced on that tree trunk, shitting in a hole in the ground for wondering, how did it come to this? 1 year earlier, back at university in Budapest, András got off to what would become a customary rocky start. His initial failures led not to a lowering of ambitions, but rather a raising. András and his ambition soon turned to analytical chemistry. Now, there were two paths to a high grade in analytical chemistry, but they both went through the laboratory. The first was a step-by-step approach of identifying and eliminating compounds. This is like beating the streets during a marathon. The step-by-step approach will get you there, but there was a risk that you would run out of time. The second approach was to start with the step-by-step process, and then once the initial results arrived, take an intuitive leap. Japanese manufacturers, year in the future, described these differences in approach as Kaizen and Kaikaku. After making progress with the first set of compounds after the step-by-step approach got him started, András then backed his intuition and flew through the next set of compounds, only, of course, to then fly, bang, straight into a brick wall. His progress stalled. With a week to go, hanging off the back of a tram so the spring air wafted over his face, his subconscious clearly working in the background, the answer hit him. Directly in the face, it seemed. He jumped off, ran home, checked his notes, and then, with, he later recalled, complete confidence, planned the next set of experiments. At that moment, did any of that matter in the grand scheme of things? No, not at all. But 1 year later, perched on that tree, it was all that mattered. The step-by-step approach, literally, as he navigated minefields, often throwing cats into the field in advance to detect any mines that might be lingering, of course the fate of the poor cats you can imagine, was always followed by an intuitive leap when he got stuck. That had gotten him as far as that tree. The next step in the process took him to Vienna. In Vienna, Victor, George's friend from back in Hungary, welcomed András warmly and gave him the third orange of his life and his very first banana. He suspiciously weighed the banana up before biting it. Ooh, he liked that banana. The fruit and that banana cast communism in a very different light. Now, wanting to get away as far as possible from Hungary, András registered with the International Rescue Committee, the IRC. They helped people become refugees into the United States. When he finally met them, He could not lie. He was like William Tell in that regard. He had not fought in the revolution. This admission brought forth quizzical looks. Why not? Everybody else they interviewed had fought the communists. The next day, his name did not make it to the list. Stunned, as he later said, as if he'd been socked in the stomach, the stepwise process had brought him to a dead end. After András recovered some sense of calm, he asked, "Where are the RIC people now? They've moved across town to interview more potential refugees." András later wrote, "I took off like a madman. I ran all the way in the cold, dark streets. My heavy shoes hurt my feet as I ran, but I did not care." When he got there, he didn't bother queuing. He barged straight to the front and told this different set of interviewers that he had relations in New York and that he would contribute as a chemist. They immediately approved his application. The intuitive leap had worked again. There would be no going back, and that parting shit on that tree in the garden of a hunchback and a gorgeous woman really did become his last memory of Hungary. András's final steps took him through Germany to his final destination in Europe, the hull of the General William G. Hahn. He was soon sailing past the white cliffs of Dover on his way to New York. He could not have known that at that exact moment the Nobel team whisked Walter Brattain, John Bardeen and William Shockley around Stockholm in an endless round of drinks, dinners and speeches as they prepared to receive their prize for inventing the transistor. They in turn could not have known or even imagined that one day soon the fate of their gadget and that of the whole world's economy would lay in the hands of a traumatized, partially deaf but handsome one-time survivor of Hitler's Third Reich and two-time survivor of Stalin's Red Army, who was, at that very moment, passing through the English Channel. Some days later, on a cold day in January 1957, András István Gróf landed in New York. Time magazine had just hit the newsstands. On its cover was the Person of the Year for 1956. The Hungarian freedom fighter. Throughout history, warriors with nothing left to lose have won the day with their bare hands or a sharp stick. András learnt from Maria to take a chance and that if it worked, to take another, until they were safe or the chances were spent. When there was nothing left to lose, an intuitive leap had to be taken. This formed the basis of his life and his management philosophy. In the next episode, when András lands in New York, we'll explore this key strategic idea further, examine personality traits and their relationship to leadership traits and strategic execution, and we'll finally meet the interconnectedness problem and learn how Bill Shockley, the Moses of Silicon Valley, led the traitorous eight to the promised land, only, just like Moses, to never enter into it himself. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Visionaries, Rebels and Machines on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people to discover the show, and of course, we'd like a few more listeners. To find out more about me, the work I do, or to buy a copy of the book, please visit the website. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next episode.